Alien woman thought no one would come then. She heard human footsteps in the cave. The cave was cold, so cold that every breath turned into a small white cloud in the air. Water dripped slowly from the jagged ceiling, each drop echoing in the darkness like a slow heartbeat. The alien woman sat with her back against the wall, her legs pulled close to her chest. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes kept moving from shadow to shadow. She had been hiding here for 3 days, maybe 4. She had lost track of time. Her wounds still burned, a deep cut across her side, and bruises on her arms. She had no food left, and only a few drops of water in the small container beside her. Every sound outside made her heart stop. She knew they were hunting her, her own people. They had called her a traitor. They had taken everything from her, and now they wanted her life too. She pressed her ear against the cold rock, listening for movement. Nothing, only the wind howling outside and the soft splash of water somewhere deeper in the cave. Her body was weak, her hands shaking from hunger and fear. The thought came again, the same thought she had tried to push away for days. No one is coming. She would die here, cold and alone, and her enemies would never even find her body. It would be as if she never existed. Her head dropped forward, her eyelids heavy. Sleep tried to take her, but the fear of being found kept her awake. She remembered the last night in her village, the flames, the shouting, the faces of the soldiers. They had not hesitated. They had cut down anyone in their path. She had run until her lungs burned, and then she had crawled into this cave. She had thought it was a safe place, but now it felt more like a tomb. Then something changed. Her eyes snapped open. The air felt different, like the cave itself was holding its breath. She heard it, faint at first, but growing clearer. Footsteps, slow and steady, echoing down the narrow tunnel. Her heart began to race. Her hands tightened around the small rock she had kept for protection. They had found her, she thought. This was the end. She waited, every muscle in her body tense. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but then she noticed something strange. The sound was not the heavy, dragging step of her people's soldiers. It was lighter, sharper, with a rhythm she did not recognize. She frowned, confused. Her people did not walk like that. The sound was different. A faint light appeared in the darkness, a small glow moving towards her. It flickered and swayed with each step. She squinted, trying to see who or what it was. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure stepped into view, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing strange dark clothing. His face was partly hidden by a helmet, but she could see the shape of his jaw, the strange pale tone of his skin. He was not one of her people. He was human. She froze, her mind racing. She had heard stories of humans, wild stories told by travelers. Some called them dangerous, unpredictable, impossible to defeat. Others called them protectors, people who would fight, even for strangers. She had never met one before, and now one was standing in the same cave, looking directly at her. The human didn't speak at first. He just stood there, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. She gripped the rock tighter, unsure if he was friend or foe. Then, slowly, he crouched down. He reached into a small pack and pulled out a metal container. He placed it on the ground and pushed it toward her. The smell of water reached her nose. She stared at it, suspicious but desperate. Her lips were dry, her throat burning. Every instinct told her not to trust anyone. But another voice in her head whispered, if he wanted to hurt you, he would have done it already. She reached forward, her hand shaking, and took the container. The water was cool and fresh, and it slid down her throat like life itself. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the strength return to her body. When she opened them again, the human was still there. He hadn't moved. His eyes were calm, almost gentle. But there was something else in them too, something hard. She realized he was watching the tunnel behind him, listening for danger. It was as if he had decided to protect her, even without knowing her name. The thought made her chest tighten. For the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone. But the footsteps that had filled her with fear still echoed in her mind, because now she knew If a human had found her here, then her enemies would not be far behind. And the silence of the cave was about to end forever. The light from the human's hand cast long shadows on the cave walls, making the jagged rocks look like sharp teeth ready to close in. The alien woman stayed where she was, her body tense, her eyes locked on the stranger. He reached into his pack again and this time pulled out a small wrapped bundle. When he opened it, the smell of warm bread filled the air. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but she still didn't move. He tore off a piece and placed it on the ground between them, then leaned back. It was not an order, not a trick, just an offering. Her fingers twitched, and finally, she reached forward, taking it quickly, as if it might disappear. The bread was soft, and even though it was plain, it tasted better than anything she had eaten in weeks. The human finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You're hurt," he said, the words strange but understandable to her ears. She didn't answer, only watched him closely. He pulled a small device from his belt and pressed it, a faint blue light scanning her side. She flinched and pressed her back to the wall, but he raised his other hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. The light passed over her wound, and the device gave a soft beep. From another pouch, he took a thin strip of fabric and a small container of cream. He poured some onto the cloth and slid it toward her. She didn't take it. Instead, he sighed, moved closer, and without touching her skin, carefully pressed the cloth to her injury. The sting made her gasp, but almost instantly, the pain dulled, replaced by a slow warmth. Outside, a gust of wind roared through the narrow tunnel, carrying with it a distant sound, voices, faint but getting closer. She turned sharply toward the noise, her heart hammering in her chest. The human was already moving, packing away his things quickly. He looked at her, his expression changing from calm to urgent. "They're coming," he said, his voice like a warning and a promise at the same time. She didn't need to ask. Who she already knew. The same soldiers who had burned her village, the same ones who would kill her without hesitation. She pushed herself up, ignoring the ache in her body. The human stepped forward and offered his hand. For a moment, she hesitated. Trust was a dangerous thing, especially now, but something in his eyes told her that walking alone would mean death. She took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. He led her deeper into the cave, away from the main entrance. The path was narrow, the ground uneven, but he moved with quiet confidence. His light revealed markings on the walls, and old symbols carved long ago. She had never been this far inside before. The air grew colder, and the darkness pressed in on all sides. Behind them, the sound of footsteps and voices grew louder. The human stopped suddenly and pressed his finger to his lips. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The soldiers were close now, their boots striking the stone floor. The human reached into his pack again and pulled out a small metal sphere. He twisted it, and it began to emit a faint humming sound, without a word. He placed it on the ground in the middle of the tunnel they had just walked through. A flash of light burst out, followed by a thick cloud of smoke. The soldiers shouted in confusion, their voices echoing wildly. The human pulled her forward again, moving faster now. She stumbled once, but his arm wrapped around her, keeping her from falling. They kept going until the sounds behind them faded. When they finally stopped, she leaned against the wall, breathing hard. The human was watching her again, not with suspicion, but as if measuring her strength. "You can walk?" he asked. She nodded, though every part of her body ached. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, approval, maybe even respect. For a long moment, they stood in silence. The only sound their breathing, somewhere deep inside. She realized this human was not just passing through. He had chosen to be here, with her, in this danger. And that meant one thing: he had his own enemies. She didn't know why, but she was certain of it, and in that moment, she understood that their paths were now tied together, whether they liked it or not. The cave began to open into a wider chamber. the ceiling high enough for the shadows to disappear into blackness. Faint streams of water trickled down the walls, forming shallow pools that reflected the dim light from the human's lamp. The alien woman's steps echoed softly, and every sound made her think of the soldiers that might still be hunting them. The human walked ahead, scanning every path before taking it, his movements sharp and deliberate. She noticed the way he always kept her behind him when they passed narrow spots, as if he was ready to take the first hit if danger came. It was strange, almost unsettling. No one had ever done that for her before. They reached a split in the tunnel, one path sloping downward, the other curving upward, toward a faint draft of air. The human crouched, ran his fingers over the stone, and then looked up at her. "They will expect us to take the high path," he said in a low voice, before she could answer. He turned toward the lower, darker passage. The air there was colder, and a strange smell hung in it, damp and metallic. She followed without a word, but unease crept into her chest. There was something in this part of the cave. Something old. They moved carefully, their footsteps soft. On the wet ground, her eyes caught strange shapes in the wall's fossils, bones, and the faint outline of long-dead creatures trapped in the stone. The human didn't slow down, but she could see his hand near the weapon on his belt. A faint sound came from ahead, not footsteps this time, but a low rumbling, like stone grinding against stone. She stopped, her eyes wide, but he only motioned for her to stay close. The sound grew louder, and a shape emerged from the shadows. It was not a soldier. It was a massive cave beast, its skin pale from years in the dark, its eyes blind, but its nose twitching at their scent. Her hand went to the small knife she had hidden, but the human shook his head. He knelt and pulled something from his pack, a small silver cylinder with blinking lights. He pressed a button, and the device began to emit a high-pitched tone. The creature froze, its head tilting as if confused. Then, slowly, it backed away into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. She stared at him in disbelief. "You didn't kill it," she whispered. He only shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Not everything needs to be killed," he said, and kept walking. They finally reached another narrow exit. A thin crack of daylight visible ahead. She could hear the wind outside, the promise of open space and fresh air. But before they could reach it, voices echoed behind them again. The soldiers had found the lower path, their shouts bouncing off the walls. The human grabbed her hand without asking and pulled her forward. They slipped through the opening just as blaster fire scorched the rock above their heads. Outside, the land stretched out into a vast rocky plain, the sky heavy with storm clouds. The human looked toward the horizon, his jaw tightening. "They won't stop," he said quietly, and she knew he was right. For the first time, she began to wonder not just who this human was, but why he had come for her at all. And the thought that scared her most was that he might not be here by accident. The wind outside cut across the rocky plain like a blade, carrying dust and sharp bits of sand that stung the skin. The alien woman pulled her thin cloak tighter around her shoulders, but it did little against the cold. The human walked ahead, scanning the horizon, his eyes never resting for more than a second. He moved like someone who had been hunted before, every step measured, every glance ready to catch danger. She followed closely, her legs aching, but her mind sharper than before. The soldiers were still behind them, but the wind carried away most sounds, making it hard to tell how far. They moved toward a cluster of broken stone pillars rising from the ground, like the ribs of some ancient giant. The human slowed, studying them. "These will give us cover," he said, and she could tell by his tone he was already thinking about the fight that was coming. She hesitated, looking back. Running was still an option, but something in her gut told her it wouldn't matter. They would be caught sooner or later. The human crouched and pulled out small metal discs from his pack. He pressed each one against a pillar, where they stuck with a faint click. "What are those?" she asked, her voice almost lost in the wind. Surprises, he replied. With the faintest trace of a grin, the sky darkened as the storm moved closer, lightning flashing in the distance. The air smelled of rain and metal, heavy and charged. The first soldier appeared over a ridge, his armor catching the light for a split second before he ducked behind a rock. Then more came, 5, maybe 6, moving in formation, weapons ready. The human stayed low, motioning for her to keep her head down. Her heart was pounding, her throat dry. She had fought before, but never like this, never against so many while. So, exposed, she glanced at the human, expecting to see fear, but instead, she saw focus. He was already pulling something from his belt, a rifle, unlike any she had seen. It was old, scratched, but looked as if it had survived 100 battles. The soldiers moved closer, their shadows slipping between the rocks. One of them shouted an order, and they broke into 2 groups, trying to flank. The human waited until the first group stepped between the pillars. Then he pressed a small switch in his hand. A sudden burst of light and sound erupted as the discs on the pillars exploded, throwing shards of rock in all directions. The soldiers stumbled, some falling, their formation broken. Now, the human said, his voice calm but sharp. She didn't need to be told twice. She drew her knife and moved with him, keeping close, striking at any enemy who got too near. The fight was fast and brutal. The human moved like water, smooth but unstoppable, each shot placed with deadly accuracy. She had thought humans fought like beasts, wild and uncontrolled, but there was nothing wild about him. Every move was calculated. Every strike meant to end the fight as quickly as possible. One soldier tried to grab her from behind, but the human was there before she could react, slamming the attacker into the stone and finishing him without hesitation. For a moment, she forgot the cold, forgot the fear. They were moving as one, covering each other, breathing in sync. When the last soldier fell, the storm finally broke. Rain came down in heavy sheets, soaking them instantly. The human checked the battlefield quickly, collecting whatever gear they could use. She stood still for a moment, watching him work. Her chest was still rising and falling fast, her mind replaying the fight. She realized she had never trusted anyone like this before, and it terrified her. The human looked up at her, water dripping from his helmet. "We keep moving," he said simply. She nodded, though part of her wanted to ask why he was helping her at all. But the words stayed in her throat, because deep down, she wasn't sure she was ready to hear the answer. The storm swallowed the plane, turning the world into a blur of gray and black. Rain struck the ground in heavy sheets, bouncing off rocks and running in thin rivers between cracks. The wind roared so loudly it drowned out even their footsteps. The human led the way, his shoulders hunched against the force of it. The alien woman struggled to keep up, her cloak plastered to her skin. Every gust felt like it might push her off her feet, but the human's hand would reach back without looking, gripping hers just long enough to steady her. They moved toward a jagged ridge rising out of the ground. The rocks there offered some shelter, but the path to reach them was exposed. Lightning flashed across the sky, revealing the shapes moving in the distance. Not soldiers this time, but machines, small drones skimming low over the ground, scanning for heat and movement. She ducked instinctively, but the human pulled her close behind a boulder. He watched the drones pass, his eyes narrowing. "They're widening the search," he said, his voice almost lost in the wind. "If they find us out here, it's over," she replied. The human studied the ridge ahead, then looked at the open ground between. Was at least 50 meters, with no cover. She shook her head, but he was already pulling something from his pack, a small metal rod with wires wrapped around it. He planted it into the ground, twisted the top, and stepped back. A low hum began to rise, so faint she felt it more in her bones than in her ears. The rain seemed to bend around the device, the air shimmering slightly. "What is that?" she asked. "A distraction," he answered, and before she could ask more, he was moving. They broke from cover, running into the open. The wind clawed at them. The mud tried to pull their feet down. She could hear the faint whine of the drones shifting direction, but it was toward the device, not them. By the time they reached the first rocks of the ridge, her lungs were burning. The human pushed her into a narrow gap between two boulders. Following close behind, the space was tight, but it shielded them from the worst of the storm. For a moment, they just breathed, rain dripping from their clothes and hair. Then he spoke again, his voice steady. "They're not just after you." She turned to him sharply. "What do you mean?" He met her gaze, his eyes shadowed under the helmet. "I've seen their orders," he said. "They want me to." The words made her chest tighten. She had assumed she was the reason he was risking so much. But now she realized this was bigger than her. Before she could ask more, the sound of heavy engines cut through the storm. They both turned toward the plane. Through the rain, the shape of a large transport carrier loomed, its lights cutting through the darkness. It was heading straight toward the ridge. The humans' jaw tightened. "They know we're here," he said, and in that moment, she understood there would be no more running. The storm raged above the ridge, lightning tearing open the sky for a heartbeat at a time. The human crouched low against the rock, his eyes fixed on the approaching carrier. The alien woman felt the ground trembling beneath her boots as its engines roared closer. Rainwater ran in streams down the slope, soaking them to the bone, but neither of them moved. Waiting for the right moment, the carrier slowed, its lights sweeping over the ridge like searching eyes. The human slid his rifle from its strap and began checking each part with quick, practiced movements. She could hear the metallic clicks even over the thunder. He handed her a small sidearm human, made heavier than the weapons she was used to. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the cold grip. "I've never fired one of these," she said quietly. "Then keep it pointed where it counts." He replied without looking at her. The carrier's ramp dropped with a metallic crash. Soldiers poured out in formation, their armor gleaming wet in the rain. They moved with precision, scanning every gap in the rocks. One soldier called out, his voice sharp in their language. She caught the words, "They're here." The human's muscles tensed. He waited until the first line of soldiers passed the halfway point up the ridge. Then he moved. His rifle barked fire. Sharp and controlled, two soldiers fell instantly, their bodies sliding down the wet slope. The rest scattered for cover, returning fire. Bolts of energy lit the air around them, striking the rocks with sizzling bursts. The alien woman leaned out just enough to fire her sidearm, the recoil jarring. Her first shot went wide, but the second found its target. A soldier spun and collapsed into the mud. The human shifted position, always moving, never giving the enemy a fixed mark. She followed his lead, darting from rock to rock, keeping low. The rain made everything slippery, but it also masked some of their movements. A grenade landed near them, hissing as it rolled. The human grabbed it and hurled it back before it could detonate. The explosion shook the ridge, sending chunks of stone tumbling down. Shouts rose from below, the soldiers regrouping. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. From the carrier, a new figure emerged, taller than the rest, armored in black, with glowing crimson lines running across the chest plate. She recognized him instantly, one of the commanders who had led the attack on her village. Her blood ran cold. But before she could speak, the commander's voice boomed over the storm. "Bring them alive." The human gave a sharp laugh, cold and humorless. "Not going to happen," he muttered, and reloaded. They fought on, each second stretching into forever. Every shot, every movement was a choice between life and death, and through it all, she realized something. The human never once positioned himself, so she was exposed. Every time danger came too close, he put himself in its path, not because he had to, but because he chose to. As the battle reached its peak, lightning split the sky again. The commander's gaze locked on them through the chaos, and she knew this fight would end only when one of them didn't walk away. The commander advanced through the rain like a shadow made solid, his armor absorbing the flashes of lightning. The soldiers tightened formation around him, their weapons firing in bursts meant to pin the human and the alien woman down. The human ducked behind a jagged boulder, his breath steady, despite the chaos. The alien woman crouched beside him, water dripping from her hair into her eyes. Her fingers tightened on the sidearm, but her focus stayed on the man beside her. He glanced at her once, and in that look, she read both a warning and a promise. The commander's voice cut through the storm again, ordering his soldiers to close in. They moved forward, shields raised, stepping over the bodies of their fallen. The human's jaw tightened. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small black device, no larger than his hand. He pressed it into hers, the metal cold even through her wet gloves. "If I don't make it, throw this at the carrier," he said. She shook her head immediately. "No, if you go down, I go down," he almost smiled. Just for a heartbeat, before leaning out and firing another volley, the soldiers pressed closer, their shots chewing into the rocks. The human shifted position, drawing fire away from her. The commander finally stepped into full view, his weapon raised. The human fired, but the commander's shield absorbed the hit, glowing red for a moment, before fading. Then the commander returned fire, and the blast struck the human square in the chest. He fell back hard against the stone, the breath knocked out of him. She caught his arm, dragging him behind cover, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the storm. Blood was running from a crack in his armor. "You're not dying here," she said, her voice breaking. The commander advanced, certain of his victory. She could hear the crunch of his boots in the mud, the hiss of his weapon charging again. The human coughed, his hand finding hers, gripping it tightly. "Do it," he said, nodding to the device. Her mind screamed at her, but her body moved. She rolled out from cover, rain hitting her face like cold knives, and hurled the device at the carrier. It struck the ramp and clamped on with a metallic snap. A second later, the world lit up with fire and sound. The carrier erupted in a burst that shook the ground, the force knocking soldiers off their feet and throwing the commander backward. She ran to the human, helping him to his feet. The fire from the carrier painted the storm in shades of orange and gold. The remaining soldiers scattered, their formation broken. The commander struggled to rise, but the human's final shot struck true, sending him collapsing into the mud. For a long moment, only the rain and the distant thunder remained. She wrapped her arm around the human's waist, supporting his weight as they moved away from the burning wreckage. Neither spoke, the silence between them heavy but unbroken. When the first light of dawn touched the clouds, they were far from the ridge. The human's steps slowed, and he looked at her. "I didn't come for you by accident," he said quietly. She stared at him, her breath caught. "You were on my list," he continued, "but not as a target, someone worth saving." Her chest tightened, and for the first time in years, she felt something she thought was gone forever: hope.